like this. You will see in the screen. I've specially dressed up. I've got Gamis Shalwar on just to show that I'm in touch with my cultural side. And on the bottom right, you've got Muhammad Al Talib, our crack associate from IFG.vc, which is the venture side of Islamic Finance Guru. And then on the top right, you'll see our roving reporter from Bolton. He is he. I don't think this is this is an effect. He is actually sat in his car. Uh,
AKA the conference room.
very nice, very nice.
Yeah.
Um, well, it's a pleasure to be here. We've got plenty to get through, so inshallah, I'll dive pretty much straight into it. So the idea behind today is that we're going to be discussing where are the next big businesses, where are the next big startups, what are the next big commercial and economic trends that are going to come, in post-COVID world, and just thinking about exactly, what are the kind of places we should be looking at this point. And the reason why we're talking about this in the first place is because at Islamic Finance Guru, on the venture side, we've got an angel syndicate called IFG.vc, which you can access if you literally type in ifg.vc on your that's the link. And the idea behind what we do there, the idea behind what we do at Islamic Finance Guru full stop is always about, Muslims are 20% poorer than the rest of the world. We want Muslims to catch up. And one of the key ways that we can do that, aside from all the personal finance stuff that we help people with, is making sure that Muslim entrepreneurs are creating the next big thing. And a big prior question to being able to find the next big Muslim entrepreneurs who are going to be the next big thing is where on earth are the next big things going to be coming from? And so that's where this question comes in, and we're thinking about where we should be looking at. So over the last month or so, while we've been in lockdown, we have each had some thoughts about sectors that we've been particularly impressed by, or have experienced firsthand and thought, this is actually something that's going to really pop now, but also potentially after COVID as well. So, Mohammed, you had some thoughts about remote working. It'd be great to hear. What was it that impressed you about it, and yeah, share your thoughts.
Yeah, 100%. So thank you all for joining this first time call that we're having. So we are now, well into the COVID crisis, and we are, well into working from home as well as a team. Beforehand, we already were to some degree remote working, but this has just sort of strengthened our time remote working. So I think COVID has really shown us that one, remote working is possible. I think there was already a trend towards remote working, but this has just sort of strengthened the argument for remote working. And I think we're going to see post-COVID, a lot of companies that previously had physical offices are going to move, completely remotely. So I just had, a few points of, why remote working is sometimes the better way of working. So there was a good book I was reading, which is Drive by Daniel Pink. And he says that, for the three things that really matter in motivating people is mastery, purpose, and autonomy. So obviously mastery is the urge to get better skills, and purpose is the desire to do something that has meaning, which hopefully, two principles that almost every company should have. But the third is autonomy. And autonomy is our desire to be self-directed or have agency over ourselves and our environment. And if you imagine remote working, that's exactly what it helps to be. And what remote working has really led is that instead of judging or monitoring work according to the number of hours you put in, rather it's about what work you produce. And that's the criteria of whether you are a good worker or not. And by working at home and setting our own schedules, I think that's really helped both employers and employees see the benefits of autonomous working. And that's also a better way to phrase it, I think, rather than remote working, also autonomous working and being responsible for your own work and tasks. So at IFG, we do practice autonomous working these days. And, in the beginning, there were a few hurdles while we were still getting used to it, and how do we work together without being next to each other, and how do we communicate? And I think we did try out a number of tools. I mean, there are the famous ones like Slack. We tried out. We tried out WhatsApp in the beginning, just normal phone calls. Eventually, what we've settled on now is Microsoft Teams, which I think we're all really loving because it really brings everything together. Whether that's voice call, voice chat, it's almost like forum-like messaging. So that's the tool that we've really settled on. But of course, there are so many out there and so many more that have been launched during this crisis. And I think everybody's getting everyone's getting ready and used to the tools that they like most. But once a company does have the infrastructure to enable remote and autonomous working, you really can. There is no limit.
Mohammed, just to jump in on that, and also it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts on this as well. What do you think are the kind of pillars of remote working? Like, what technologically, I'm just thinking, what are the pillars? Like, if we're looking for an emerging startup, what kind of 3 or 4 areas do we think will need to be, joined together to create a really cool a work from home experience, or do we think that it's going to be like the race is already won, and it's basically Teams or Slack and that kind of it? What are your thoughts?
I mean, I think it changes all the time, and especially according to how you work, and especially the size of the team, where the teams are located, the levels of hierarchy. I mean, in the very early days of IoT.VC, we were using WhatsApp, and WhatsApp worked perfectly. Everything was in there. There was no organization of the different projects. Chats and messaging and calls were all in WhatsApp. But very quickly that became outdated, and we had to move to different tools. I think that'll continue. As we grow as a company, and I think that'll be the same for almost anybody. There never is the one tool. I've heard people advocating that Notion is the one. Everyone moved to Notion. I've heard people talking about Teams and saying Teams is the one, and everyone else saying Slack is the tool. So I do think it's different for everybody, and you do have to try a number of different tools, just as we did. We went through maybe 10 different tools before we settled.
Look at you, like, distancing yourself from people who say, "Oh, this is the one." You're the one who forced us onto Airtable, and then you forced us on all sorts of other things. The amount of subscriptions that we've had to sign up to because of Mohammed.
What this does show, though, is exactly what you said, Mohammed. That is very, very different for different people. And thinking about it from a business perspective, that means that there's space for a lot of people in the market, because people are going to find their own little nuances. We see it with, like, think about mobile phones. You can't go to many dinner parties or whatever without getting into an Apple versus Android debate, right? I mean, ultimately they do very, very similar things, but people they like things very, very slightly differently. And I think that's going to be even more the case with remote working tools. So I think it very much depends on the type of work, the type of business, the type of person that you are, and it's hard at an organizational level to satisfy, say, 100, 200, 1,000 employees who are all happy with this one particular tool. So there's going to be an element of flexibility, but then there's going to be an element of the organization needs to decide on what is best for the business, and then roll that out across the employee base. And then it's a matter of training. Just like you see across lots of different types of software, when you go into an organization, you have to adapt to the organization. I think what that means, though, is that touching on what you said, Ibrahim, like, is the race already pretty much done, in the sense that we know who the competitors are, and there aren't really anyone else to come into the race? Because if you think about it from an enterprise and a big business perspective, who are you going to go with? Are you going to go with established players like Microsoft with their Teams offering? Are you going to go with Zoom, who, although they're relatively new company, they're still very well established, they're listed on the stock exchange, etc. As a big enterprise, you do not want to take risks with your tech and with your software. So I think it's very, very likely that you're going to go with a big player in this remote working space, and that's why my view, and this is one of the reasons that I like Microsoft as a potential stock to buy. I think that they've got such a big offering in the whole enterprise space, that it makes sense that their Teams offering it will do well. The data suggests that their usage is up huge amounts during this pandemic, and it's likely that some of those will stay on for a very long time to come. So I think that remote working is definitely there.
So do you think then, and just to round off this discussion, because I know there's lots more to cover, do you think then that perhaps, what we're looking at right now is, I mean, we're happy with Teams, but maybe that there's apps that could be on Teams that would be quite useful in certain instances to do certain stuff? Is that where we think this next, big startups, the next startups are going to come from in this area?
I think I don't know about next big startups. That remains to be seen. But I think what will happen in terms of innovation is that you'll see, I mean, you see it now, for example, look with, browsers. You've got Chrome, you've got Firefox. I mean, nobody really talks about Internet Explorer now. I think mostly it's Chrome. And then you've got people working in the back end of things, and they have a marketplace for add-ins, plugins or whatever they call it. And you've got coders doing that sort of thing. And if you look, we use Microsoft Teams. This isn't like a pitch for Microsoft, by the way, but they've got like loads of add-ins that you can do. And I think it'll be a case of the innovation, I guess, will probably come in. How can we supplement, these established players by making things easier for people?
Just quickly on that point of the next big thing, I do think where the next big thing is going to come from is from the death of the middle manager. We're seeing a lot of innovative tools coming out on how to monitor employee performance, and that was a role previously done by middle managers, whereas now, because of autonomous working and people reporting their own performance using AI tools and that AI feedback as well, I think that's where we'll see a big growth and potentially the next big thing coming out of that.
Yeah, that's actually a really good shout. Because then you can do some really interesting stuff. Because as a business, you want to increase productivity, you want to increase efficiency, you want to have oversight over what's going on. And when you move it away from the human to some kind of system, that becomes quite interesting. Let's move on. There are a couple of questions that have come in. Let's deal with those questions live, because otherwise, poor Ammar Ahmed, who's asked the question, will have to stick around and listen to us babbling on for the next 40 minutes before he gets there. So let's deal with his question, and then let's talk about live streaming and video. So hopefully the question should be showing up now. So Ammar has asked where this 20% projected annual return that IFG.VC, on the halal investment comparison, where that number comes from. Good question, Ammar. So really, it's difficult to actually pinpoint exactly what you're going to make in terms of returns in the startup world. Where that 22% figure has come from is that the government entity, Nesta, I think is the name, did some research, and they found that on an annualized basis, over 7 years, if you had invested in pretty much every startup that came about in the UK and just did that, then you would have made a 22% annualized return on those startups. Now, that's actually a conservative figure because of a number of reasons. Firstly, as a syndicate, we don't invest in all startups. We invest in startups that are quality startups that are from our networks, that, alhamdulillah, fairly strong. And so we would want to reduce the number of startups that fail and increase the number of startups that hit it big. So we would actually think that percentage would be a lot higher. But because we don't want to say stuff that is unsubstantiated, firstly, but also stuff that is so bold a claim that it's quite hard to live up to. That's why we've just gone with the 22%. And if you literally Google 22% Nesta, I'm pretty sure you'll find the report, and it's an interesting report to read. The equivalent in the US, there's a US report as well, and that was 27% annualized. So this is pretty solid, but also really important, Ammar, by the way, is that this is a portfolio-based approach when you come to startup investing. You shouldn't invest in just one or two startups, because a lot of startups, if not the majority, fail. So the whole game in startups is trying to pick the few small numbers of winners and making sure you double down on them and just riding that wave. But that's we can go into that inshallah in a separate perhaps podcast or in a separate series. But Jazakallah khair for writing in. And then there is another question from Saeed. Let's just deal with that as well. Saeed has asked, is it a good time to buy stocks like Slack, Square, post-COVID? Well, without giving actual specific tips, without having looked into these companies, high level, these companies are, in the discussions that we've had just now, they will be, we think, trending upwards. Now, it remains, it's a separate question whether or not that growth potential is already priced into the stock price already or not. That is something that you'll have to look into, but we think that those kind of sectors are on the up, but it's a separate question whether or not you should enter it right now. Let's talk about live streaming and video, because that is what we're doing in a way right now. So live streaming, I was looking at some data. I mean, obviously there's a whole range of these things now, isn't there? There's iPlayer, Netflix, Twitch, Hulu, Disney have brought out something. Maybe we should do one. Maybe we should bring out an Islamic Finance Guru live webinar, live stream or something. And these guys, looking at some of the numbers, they were up by like 65%. People binge watching series and movie watching was up 70%. Amazon's streaming platform Twitch was up 31% in number of viewership, and the hours that were watched on there jumped in literally a couple of weeks from 33 million to 43 million. So this is it's a massive growth area right now, and I think that I actually think that this is going to largely subside once we're back in post-COVID territory, but there will be a residual effect here. I think things like this, like live webinars, I think are going to continue because people have used them and they're like, actually, this is quite easy, this is quite cool, this, why don't we do this? And I think there'll be a lot of this kind of residual stuff that will continue. The other thing that I think this has shown is that we have a lot of stress on the bandwidth, the underlying engines that power everything that we do. And that stuff, I think, is in desperate need of upgrade. We'll talk about this later on. There are sectors that are not sexy, so to speak, and those are the sectors that there is a hell of a lot of potential in. And quite frankly, each of those sectors are being, really, really tested these days because they're so essential. And we'll talk about what those sectors are later on. But one of them is infrastructure. So I think the second big trend to think about when it comes to streaming and live video and the startups that are emerging from here is infrastructure. And if you look at what are the big startups, what are the big companies in the world right now? Google, Amazon, right? Microsoft. Each of these companies, they are at least in large part or in some part infrastructure companies. So Google has its own, cloud computing, its email providing. Microsoft has its email service. It has its databases. It has its hosting service. And Amazon has AWS. The entire world, the entire startup world certainly runs off these servers. It runs off this computational power that these guys are selling. So these guys, while they may be, on the front end, they might be great businesses, separate businesses. In the back end, they are also selling this major infrastructure, resource. And I think that, potentially some of the big changes that will happen that can really shake this stuff up is quantum computing. So quantum computing, at the moment we've got binary, which is zeros and ones. So computers have data that they store in zeros and ones. So there's two states. But in quantum computing, if I'm not wrong, that's the number of states changes to 8, or it might even be 16. And so suddenly, you have a massive increase in computational power, and that then opens up all sorts of other things that could happen. But to roll all that back, I think the person who comes up with that kind of technology in one, with some good strategy behind him, they could just completely undercut Google, Amazon, and all these guys, and they could just streak miles ahead because of that data. And then the final thing I wanted to say with these kind of streaming and live video services is that they are incredibly profitable, lucrative, and stable businesses. People are asking about, is it worth it to invest in something like Netflix right now, or is it worth it to, putting aside the Sharia compliance question for a moment, is it worth it to invest in these companies that are, they're already really highly priced? But I read an interesting analysis by a guy on LinkedIn, actually, our man Asim Qureshi, who shared this really interesting analysis where he said that Netflix has a churn rate of 3% per annum, 3% per month. So that means that Netflix loses 3% of its users every month. Now, what that means is that if it has $1 of revenue today, then next month, and it gets no new customers, by the way, then next month it will get $0.97 of revenue, and then 0.9409 in the following month. And the sum of all of this infinite, geometric sequence is $33.3. So that means that, because Netflix customers are paying about $2 billion at the moment, they will end up paying Netflix ultimately $67 billion over the years. And that's without a single new customer being added. So Netflix has a market cap currently of 187 billion. There's already booked a third of that in its revenue immediately, right? Because because of the churn rate being so low, it's already booked that stuff. And of course, Netflix is not just keeping its old customers; it's actually creating a whole lot of new content and constantly adding hundreds of thousands of new customers. So the question of whether or not Netflix is a robust business, in Asim Qureshi's view, and to be honest, my view, and I'm convinced having read that, is that it is a super, super profitable business, and it's going to be here for a while. I appreciate I've been talking for a while. Guys, what are your thoughts?
I mean, for sure, 100%. Everything you said, definitely. The world has now moved onto a computer-based world, and as you said about the companies who host these services, and the underlying infrastructure is super important for the movement of economies and for the movement of the world. I mean, we live in a globalized world because of the internet, and it's the infrastructure that allows that is super important.
What it does show, interestingly, is that the reason, as I understand it, that AWS exists. So this is Amazon's like web services. So for those of you who don't have a need for all these products, the way to understand this is it's basically like getting cash and carry prices for your everyday goods. So Amazon Web Services, AWS, they sell their infrastructure, their server space, all this tech stuff that a lot of businesses need nowadays, and they sell it really, really cheap. And they basically just take everybody else out of the market. There's also Google, who have their cloud offering. There's also Microsoft, who have a similar but not exactly the same offering. And the whole, the reason this is really interesting is because, on the front end, they're very, very different businesses. If you go on the street and you say, what do you think of when you think about Amazon? Most people are going to say, Amazon Prime, get whatever you want. They're not going to say AWS. And so all of this, what I think it means is that what we might well see is this trend towards these large businesses, so Apple, Microsoft, Google, these big guys who have this front end business, basically taking the lead on other industries that are not their primary business. And it's a great example of what I love seeing in startups. Actually, what I love seeing in startups is interesting ways that they can make money beyond that front facing business. I love it when we get pitched a startup and it's not immediately clear to me how they make money, but then when they tell us, it's like, that's really interesting. And then you can start seeing loads of different ways that they can make money. So if you're a startup founder, that's definitely something important to think about.
Jazakallah khair. Mohsin, do you want to carry on and talk about logistics? Isn't it that's your passion?
Yeah, I never thought I'd say that, but I've been thinking a lot about logistics in this post-COVID world, and I mean, let me just start with an analogy. Like, if your house gets robbed, if you've ever had the misfortune of your house getting robbed, um, life just doesn't go back to normal the next day or the next hour. You start thinking a lot of things. You start thinking about, okay, I need to phone the insurer. I need to get my home contents replaced. I need to fit, a new lock. I need to fit security cameras so this doesn't happen again, etc., etc. And the point I'm making here is that, after this, event, after this pandemic, things are not going to be the same. You're going to have people and you're going to have big organizations thinking, okay, we've survived it somehow. Now, what are we going to do to basically stop that happening again, or to plan as best we can? And I was thinking about this in the context of logistics because I was reading a survey from the Institute of Supply Chain Management rather, that said that 75% of businesses had faced supply chain distribution. What that means is that businesses are, from their suppliers, facing problems in terms of getting stuff to them. What that means is that as a business, you then cannot sell your stuff because you can't get hold of the raw materials that you need to make your stuff. And what all of this means is that people are going to start thinking heavily about their logistics, and that's good news for logistics companies, right? Because um, if you're a Royal Mail, or you're some other courier company, it's good news for you because people have understood your value throughout this pandemic. I mean, look how reliant we are on couriers right now to get important emergency supplies up and down the country. Look how reliant we are on even things like takeaway drivers, or things like that. So logistics has shown itself to be a really, really important fabric of society. And if you're an investor, then that's definitely something worth thinking about when it comes to the public markets. But I think what's probably more interesting than that is that all of this means that there's going to be a wave of innovation that comes off the back of this. Because if you think about the logistics industry, and I'm not, I don't profess to be an expert in logistics, but it strikes me as the sort of industry that wasn't exactly, vanguard. It's not a pioneering industry when it comes to innovation. Uh, but I wonder what their approach will be after this pandemic. So if you think about, for example, driverless technology, yes, there were, that sort of technology was getting a bit of credibility before the pandemic. What I suspect, though, is that it's going to be taken a lot more seriously after this pandemic. I mean, think about the repercussions of driverless technology. If that were live and kicking right now, if all of these companies had taken it really seriously 10, 15 years ago and invested a lot of money, we would have right now the ability to just roll out 100,000 driverless cars. We'd be able to deliver emergency supplies pretty much wherever. It wouldn't really be a problem. And it goes back to my point earlier about when your house gets burgled, you start thinking about the next time, the next time it gets burgled. And what I think is going to happen is logistics companies and other connected industries are going to start taking these technologies a lot more seriously because they've seen that moment. They've seen that kind of dystopian moment where everything was driven down, everything ground down to a halt. And so things like driverless technology and things that seemed kind of pie in the sky, I think they'll definitely be a lot more readiness to accept those forms of technology and actually invest in them. Um, that extends to things like drones. Drones were fairly mainstream knowledge before, but I think now there's going to be a bit more of an emphasis on actually investing in them and actually really bringing these things to the mainstream. I think that logistics technology will see a lift. So thinking now about software companies who are operating in logistics space, I think they'll see an interesting uptick. I took a delivery the other day from I think it was like DPD or some other courier, and obviously nowadays they can't hand me a pen and they can't hand me that device anymore to sign on. And so what they did was the guy, he took a step back and he took a picture of the package at my doorstep with me in the picture, and that's the way they're adapting right now. But there's definitely better ways to do that. I mean, what was happening to that picture? How are they storing that? How are they sending that? How are they linking that to this particular delivery? There's technology out there that's being created that these guys were not looking at before, but now they sure as hell will be taking that call.
100%.
I can imagine. And also, just like, just think generally, we live in an on-demand economy, right? We knew that before the pandemic, and that's become increasingly the case during the pandemic. We live on, Just Eat and Uber Eats, and we live at the click of a button where we expect things to come. And all of that relies on an industry that has the relevant plumbing behind it, so that these logistics operations can work in a really efficient way. So to cut a long story short, those are some musings that I had on why I think logistics is an interesting space. I think there's a lot of interesting things to come out of there, and it's definitely worth thinking about from an investment angle too when it comes to startups.
100%. No, Jazakallah khair, Mohsin, for that. And I was thinking when you were talking about, probably now is a good moment to, talk about those boring and not sexy sectors that are actually, really, really in use these days. And there's a campaign by some venture capital organizations that was launched called, I believe, Revisited, and they're saying that we need to invest a lot more in things that we are just desperately in need of right now, and that doesn't have historically that much money thrown at it. Because and those sectors, they said, are things like health, education, climate change, infrastructure, things like that, which are logistics, things that are in desperate need right now, but unfortunately we have historically not really invested in them. And a cynic could actually say that the creme de la creme of technological talent and brain power over the last, let's say 20 years ago, it all used to go to investment banks, and what a waste that was. And then, 10 years ago, it started going to Facebook, Google, Amazon, and on these guys. And so, over the last 10 years, we have the majority of talent has gone into getting people to chat online and share banal random things, and optimize how ads appear. Basically the majority of talent is currently sat in two massive ad companies who are basically just selling ads, right? And that just seems a bit of a waste, when we could have, if we took the same amount of talent and energy and effort and put it into things like climate change, health, education, we could have come along in leaps and bounds. And I think there's an article, I think, by Peter Thiel, if I'm not wrong, but he was making basically the point that with about 100, I think, billion or a million, anyway, with a large number, NASA put a man on the moon within a few years. But with much more money than that, what have we done other than get Facebook Live going, or creating a Facebook Messenger, and doing that really efficiently. So I think it's just genuinely high time that we started investing in the boring stuff. Because and actually, alhamdulillah, IFG.VC, we've invested in education, we've invested in climate change, we've invested in infrastructure, and that's the stuff we want to continue doing, inshallah.
It's an interesting point. I think one thing, as you were saying that I remembered, I was reading that this whole thing about remote working and how this is going to change the way that we think and all that kind of stuff. They're predicting perhaps that road usage will go down. So that has a whole link with oil and demand and all that kind of thing. But what I thought was interesting was that one of the things that it mentioned is that because of whether this is a valid argument or not is a separate discussion, but let's assume that road usage will go down. What that means is that the government doesn't have to spend as much money on road repairs. And I think they estimated it at 27 billion or so.
Wow.
that would go into road repairs and road maintenance and all that kind of stuff. And if we could then plow that money into getting, for example, the UK into completely fiber optic networks, for example, what an impact that would have on innovation in this country.
Sheikh
For sure,
Mohammed,
100%.
Mohammed, did you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think exactly what you guys are saying is definitely true, and I think we will see the industries such as online streaming, such as the infrastructure, the obvious industries that will become more apparent after COVID. But I think what it's also showing us is you can see the strong founders of companies compared to the the weaker founders, and you can see even the companies that you would think would completely fail during this crisis are actually innovating and coming up with completely new ways of dealing. A good example that I saw recently was an escape room. And you'd think escape rooms would be completely shut down out of business because they're a very physical thing. But this company actually came up with at home escape room where they would send you, and I actually ordered one, an envelope where it has the puzzle inside the envelope, and you do the puzzle, this very interactive puzzle in your house. So instead of going to the physical escape room, you do it in your house. And they actually saw their sales increase exponentially more than when they actually had their physical escape room. So it's also saying, entertainment still exists as a need. It's just the way we cater for it. So even the businesses that we would think would completely fail are sometimes the businesses that can innovate in this time and create ways where they can actually increase revenue. And I think even one of our own companies saw a drop in their sales up to half because of the crisis. But then they won a contract with another company, and they actually saw their expected revenues double. So that was they completely flipped themselves over and changed to something else. So you can see great examples of strong entrepreneurs. So don't doubt the traditional industries either. Even the ones that you think may fail, what you should look for is how are those companies changing and innovating to deal with our new world.
Jazakallah khair, Mohammed. So we've got a few more questions, so we'll deal with them first, and then we're going to go into two more sections. The first is really quickly whistle stop tour from each of us about what are we thinking about investing in right now, and then the second will be what about the wider macro trends that are going to play into all this stuff. And by macro trends we mean like macroeconomic global trends. So Kestrel, who are friends of ours actually, Kestrel are a Islamic digital challenger bank type thing that have recently set up. Say, Salam, with stock markets as they are, do you see firms moving away from IPOing and instead looking to be acquired? Looking at the Airbnb incident, do either of you have any thoughts on that? You want to take that?
I'll take that.
Yeah.
So I think, generally speaking, over the recent years, we've seen a trend towards the private markets anyway. I think companies have been, they might as well stay in the private markets given the valuations that have been going. And we've seen the likes of Uber who did IPO, when the real world, if you can call it that, tells them that actually, your company is worth nowhere near what the private markets were paying for you. So I think generally, companies are reluctant in a sense to IPO because the valuations in the private market have been better. Whether that changes or not because of the current environment remains to be seen. I suspect that valuations will come down. I think the IPOing is difficult for a company. If there's real value in what companies are doing, there's always going to be interest from other people. And I don't think it's one or the other. I don't think you say, oh, we're going to wait to be acquired or we're going to IPO. I think it's it very much depends on company to company, the stage that they're at, and to be honest, like if you're at the point where you're about to IPO, chances are that your valuation's got to a point where you're starting to look a bit less attractive to a potential acquirer. Potential acquirer might start looking at you in your early, maybe your scale up days, or just after that point. But when you're at the kind of IPO stage, it's kind of, I think the valuation might put you out of reach potentially.
Jazakallah khair. Imran K123 has asked, given the pressures on the global supply chain at the current moment, do you envisage a retreat from globalization in the coming years? Will companies revert back to onshoring?
Very, very good question. So I'll take that, given that it's on the logistics side of things.
Sure.
So I think that this is something that I was thinking about as well. Whether as part of that, so I mentioned earlier that you're going to have corporates that are going to start planning for the next time something like this happens. Think about terrorism, for example, and when terrorism was kind of on the rise and all that kind of stuff. What we saw, and we've all worked in companies where we've seen the kind of disaster planning, and they literally have it. In the event of a bomb, this will be the place of work, and this is how you access, and so on and so forth. And I think we'll find similar things post this COVID environment. And I think one of those trends might well be companies, maybe not 100% onshoring, but definitely I think diversifying their supply chain. Because if you're a company right now, and a lot of small retailers had this, where 100% of your supply was coming from China, for example. Before the coronavirus hit us, obviously they were hit massively even before the lockdown. So there are retailers, especially on the e-commerce side, who they've had businesses literally shut down for like the last 4 months, 5 months. Because China has obviously, they were the first to be hit. So I think what we'll see is diversification. Some of that might include onshoring again.
Brilliant.
I think we're already seeing that, actually. If you look at, I think Japan announced a couple of $1 billion they were giving companies who would move the operations from China to Japan, back to Japan.
Yeah.
So governments are already doing that and bringing their companies back on shore.
Brilliant. So let's move on and have a bit of a whistle-stop tour in the next 5 minutes, just like one-liners from each of you, or two-liners from each of you, on what are you each keen on investing in right now.
Yeah, maybe I'll go first. So for me, it's definitely medtech. And I mean, we're seeing, especially with the COVID and the focus on our health, ongoing health checks at home. So sort of, health monitoring and monitoring our physical and mental health, actually. And I think you're seeing an increasing trend towards fitness trackers. So things like Fitbits, for example. I came across the other day a mental or mood tracking application that actually uses AI and your facial expressions and the change of your voice over time to track your mood and tell you if they think that you're feeling a bit depressed or your mental health is going down, and then give you tips on how you can improve your mental health. So I think it was already a trend on tracking things like your sleep and what you eat and your running trends. So I think they'll just increase and become more and more. But also for people like who have diseases like diabetes, for example, I've also seen a few products that allow constant checking at home rather than going to the hospital, to the doctor. So I saw a device the other day which sort of, instead of pricking your finger every time to do the test, it's a slight prick that is constantly on you, and the device constantly lives on you and constantly tells you your glucose levels or your insulin levels. So you're also seeing more devices like these to allow people to monitor and check their health from the home environment. I think some of the companies we're looking for, we're also looking at moving a device that checked health that you have to go to a specialist for, and that device allowed it was for the elderly, mostly elderly people, and allowed care homes to actually use the device in their care homes, saving them the money of going to the hospital, allowing them to detect the disease earlier, and a lot of other benefits. So I think where I would place my money is actually medtech and the move towards health monitoring.
Jazakallah khair, Muhammad. Really, really interesting area that is. And perhaps we can talk about it later on as well. Mohsin, you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, for me, it's education and technology in that whole space. This is something that I thought was going to happen in any event. I think it was inevitable, but I think that COVID-19 has really, really accelerated it, and I think it's basically the catalyst, I think, for the education sector to be, changed, I think, forever. The reason I say that is because, think about what's happened. You've got, we all know that the technology existed for things to be moved online, but nobody was ever forced to actually move it online in a way that we have been forced to move it online during this pandemic. You've got, universities, Harvard, Oxford, like every single university, big or small, have had to move their entire model online, which is absolutely unprecedented. And these were people that thought, we can't really do everything online. They were maybe trying out some things online. We had courses online from MIT, for example, and stuff like that, but nobody ever had to move everything online completely. So the point is that COVID has forced everything online, from universities to schools, even to like nurseries and stuff like that. And what that has done is it's changed the mindset, because previously even educators were of the mindset that, you know, we can't fully do this online, it's not the same as being in person. And I think crucially teachers were also parents were also of that mindset, where they thought, you know, things can't be fully online. And I think what we have seen during this time, I was reading a study that I think about 47% of parents were pretty comfortable with homeschooling. um, and crucially, that was the middle class type of people, the ones that have a bit of money to spend on resources and things like that. So I think, in a nutshell, where I think this is going is potentially a few things, but I think the most compelling and attractive thing that I can see is, especially in slightly older kids, so I'm thinking maybe 13 onwards, potentially kids just dropping out of school with their parents' permission, and taking ownership of their schooling. They'll source the online teachers, they'll source all the resources, they will actually decide their curriculum, they will teach themselves investing and finance and coding and all these skills that they're not getting in school, that are actually really, really important for the real world. So I think that there's definitely a lot of potential in education. I think our mindset has changed during this pandemic.
Jazakallah khair, Mohsin. So I think my one is investing in deep tech, and investing in companies that are long-term companies. And these things are, it's not necessarily, a symptom of COVID. These companies are just great companies to invest in, full stop, because they have that key ingredient that marks out a potentially great startup. A lot of these companies, by the way, could fail, but the key ingredients that these companies have is that they are building that moat around them. They are building that defense that stops other companies from coming in and copying them. Like if it's taken you a year to develop that technology that you are then using to monetize, it's going to put you ahead of other companies, full stop, because it's going to take them a while to catch up. And that's very different to, for example, a company that, like a newsagent, for example, or like a kebab shop that opens up on Ilford Lane. Like you're competing still. It's a good business model, but it's a different business model, and you're competing on different metrics, and your margins are going to be slashed, because every single new shop that comes in is going to be able to take customers off you. Whereas if you are someone that is a deep tech company, and what do I mean by deep tech? I mean things, companies that are using this new wave of technologies that are coming of age for the first time in our lifetimes. So things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, the increase in computational power. Like, before we used to have laptops that were massive, and now we have phones that are tiny and that are much, much more powerful than those laptops. So that we've got this fantastic combination of, even genetic and biochemistry technology, right? All of these things are now combining, and for the first time, they're combining and actually adding to each other. Like before, we had we had phone technology and we had cars, and for many, many decades they were kind of running separately. Great technologies, but running separately. And it was only once we got Bluetooth and stuff that they actually combined for the first time. But what we're seeing now is new technologies come around that are actually helping each other develop even faster. So that, I think, is something that I'm really interested in. We've had a couple of questions, comments come in from Usman Rana, who's saying, why doesn't someone do something like a student ISA, an income share agreement? Why doesn't something like that exist in the UK? The idea is that you pay back the loan when the student earns a threshold salary. It would help with the debt riba angle as well. And he says that Lambda School in the US is doing well with a similar model. And so, Usman, maybe I'll take this one. I think it's a good question. I believe that there is a US Sharia. So the mainstream equivalent of this, I don't think necessarily is Sharia compliant. I think it needs a little bit of finessing to make it Sharia compliant. I believe there is a Sharia compliant version in the USA right now. I haven't looked into the detailed contracts of it to be able to opine on it definitively. Not that I could anyway. I'm not Mufti, but I haven't looked at it in detail. In the UK, I think that this could well be something that's really beneficial. However, there's a few things that block it. The first thing is, in the US, you already have a loan market for student loans. Otherwise, if you don't have money, you get money from the bank, you have a student loan. Whereas in the UK, if you don't have money, you get a student loan from the government, and that's easy to get, and it's quite appealing, the terms that you get it on. And so for Muslims, or for anyone who is struggling to get to pay a student loan off, student fees off directly, it makes sense for them just to go for the student loans as opposed to go for this kind of salary earn out setup. I don't think if you're going to make this kind of setup commercial, I don't think it makes sense for it to be in the UK focused on students necessarily. I think it would make sense much more to target it on people who are actually in jobs and earning money, and saying to them that you could get onto the housing ladder by, for example, staking a percentage of your future salary now, and that's beneficial for you because you will save on rent by this much, and even though you have to pay us back a bit extra from your salary, that is still less than what you'd end up saving. I think that could be an interesting model to think about. But yeah, Jazakallah khair for sending in your thoughts and comments, and everyone else, please do continue, sending in your questions, thoughts, comments. We love to hear from you, and happy to make you part of this discussion as well. So final section is thinking about wider macro trends and things. What are the kind of things that are going to be shaping our future world? And perhaps I can kick off this one because I just love the sound of my voice. Right, I've been talking for so long, I might as well just continue. I think the one obvious one is that there's going to be a recession, credit crunch type effect that's going to happen. And for people that are in the financial sector, they can see this happening already, where businesses are being turned away from getting finance. Businesses are starting to default on loans. When this is just the start of what then quickly snowballs and turns into a full-on recession. Now, I don't know if we're going. I'm not an economist. I'm not close to the details on the economics of it right now. So I don't know if we're going to have an equivalent recession to what we had in the global financial crisis. But what I do know is that we're going to have similar kind of trends that will come about as they did in the recession. And so things like companies that do well out of debt or insolvency, legal practices, for example, will probably do quite well. Divorce lawyers and all that kind of industry will probably do quite well. You'll have lenders, especially challenger lenders, doing very well because they will typically lend to people who have lower credit ratings. You'll probably have payday loan companies doing quite well. You'll have takeaways doing quite well because people, when they're unemployed, they typically, for some reason, they use takeaways a lot more and they have a lot more time to do that. So that could be an interesting trend to think about. What are your thoughts, Mohsin?
So interestingly, I was reading from I think it was the Tesco boss who was talking about trends as well. Not necessarily with like a recession angle, but he was talking about trends that have happened during the pandemic, but that will stick later. And it got me thinking, because he was saying that, what we used to see maybe 10-ish years ago was that there was this habit of consumers to do one weekly shop. Then that changed and the supermarkets noticed this, and people stopped doing one big weekly shop of like 100 quid, and they'd do maybe 3-4 nip to the shop type shops, and that's why you see nowadays you've got a lot more smaller, like Morrison's Locals and Tesco Expresses, etc. That's a response to that consumer behavior. And he was saying that people are going back to this one time a week thing. Whether that feeds into, and I think it does. I think it feeds into the whole simplicity thing. What we've seen during this pandemic is people have gone back to almost like to their roots, to pure simplicity. We stay at home, we stay with the kids, we cook at home, we eat at home, or we get a takeaway in. We don't really venture. We're certainly not going abroad. That whole simplicity is what people really flock to in times of a recession. So certainly on like the supermarket side, we'll probably see people going back to that one time a week thing. Even like more widely, think about everyone that's been really hard done by, certainly in the UK, like the government, the government schemes that have come out. They've really, frankly, done bad by a lot of people because a bunch of people went self-employed and they're not eligible to get anything this year. So what we might see is slight anxiety about starting a business, and what I think that does for people who do then start a business is perhaps, in a weird kind of twist, create more opportunity for them. So yeah, those are like my kind of off the top of my head thoughts.
Jazakallah khair. And Muhammad, quick thought from you as well?
Yeah, just quickly, I think I'll just comment a bit on society actually and how we are going to rethink the way we work together. I think there's been a lot of discussion around universal basic income, for example. We always talked about the utopia where robots work for us. I think we're going to start seeing that. I also think that we'll see people who've been made redundant from their workplace. Perhaps they are now going to start diversifying their income stream. So instead of perhaps maybe working for one company, they'll hone more on their skills and maybe even work, have several income streams, whether that's investments, whether that's, freelancing their skills outwards and not being, just focus on one company. I also think that there's going to be a move towards how can we work better together as a society. So I think this is the first time that we have a recession that's almost can be predicted and that we can almost plan for, given that we know what was caused. It was caused by the COVID crisis, whereas previous recessions almost like we just fell into them. So I think that also means that people can plan how can they work together. So we've seen people who have been asking their landlords for discounts on their rentals, for example, and landlords are very happy to share that burden and risk of this crisis that we're in with their tenants. And that's a very positive way to move towards, I think, a society which cares for each other and a society that's not fully focused on, how much can I grab, but rather one that we share the burden with each other.
Sure. Jazakallah khair, Muhammad. Really, really good thoughts. We've got a bunch of questions. Let's rip through some of these questions and thoughts. So Wahid is asking, Ahmed is asking, are buy-to-let houses a good idea at the moment, or should we wait for the recession before purchasing a property? Really good question. Don't mind taking that. The housing market generally, and the bargains generally follow the 3 Ds. Let me see if I can remember them correctly: death, debt, and divorce. That's the one. And right now we're in a perfect storm of all 3. So debt is very, very cheap from the banks. Divorce rates are up, and death rates are up as well, sadly. And so we have a situation where you're going to be able to pick up a whole lot. And by the way, debt is of 2 sides, right? And there's also, not only is the debt cheap for you to buy a house, but also the debt is increasing on the side of the consumer. So that means a lot of people are defaulting on their mortgages, which will mean that banks will close on those, and they will then put them on auction. So for all of these reasons, you're probably going to pick up some absolute bargains in the coming 6 to 12 months. And it possibly might even be 18 months that you see these bargains slowly, because it takes, as I said, it takes a bit of time for this recession to properly bite. But once it does, then there's going to be some absolute bargains to be had. And we are actually, if you go on our website on Islamic Mortgage, the Islamic Mortgage page, IslamicFinanceGuru.com / I think Islamic Mortgages, or just go on the website and you'll see it. We've got a bridge financing and auction financing provider that is listed there, who can help get you the financing that you need to actually buy houses on auction, which is, I think, an absolute game changer for Muslims, because for the first time we can, even if you don't necessarily have the capital right there and then, you can get that house and get some property off an auction. In terms of our buy-to-let house is a good idea at the moment, but should you wait for the recession before purchasing a property? I think that I would probably wait to see how things play out. But yeah, definitely keep it on your radar. This is a trend of COVID as well, where Suleiman keeps on appearing. Okay, next question. Where are we? So next question is Ibrahim the Gamer has two questions, which are: which one to invest in, real estate or bonds, or equity, crowdfunding, or stock market? Mohsin, you want to take that?
Yeah, why not? So I don't think it has to be either or, right? I think you should have a diversified portfolio, as I'm sure you've heard many people tell you. So my quick thoughts on all of them, just really high level. Real estate, I think Ibrahim's covered that quite nicely. I think the old adage, safe as houses. I think there's probably going to be some decent bargains to pick up if you are going to individually buy houses in the next 12, 18 months or so. Bonds, I mean, assuming they are obviously Sharia compliant, then yeah, they're great to have a fixed income element of your portfolio. The only thing to bear in mind is that you will probably see slightly lower yields if stock price, if the stock market goes down. So the bond market will go up, and so your yields will go down. So that's just something to bear in mind for the fixed income element. Equity crowdfunding, I'm not sure if that is for real estate or startups, or I'm not sure exactly. But I mean, because you've lumped it with stock market, so I'll assume it's perhaps startups. But if it is startups, then yeah, I mean, we're big fans of startup investing, as you know. I think that as long as you're comfortable that it's a relatively small portion of your portfolio and you're happy with the risk that goes with startup investing, then this is a time. Typically, crises are moments of innovation. So you'll have seen, the list of companies that came out of the 2008 crisis. I think Uber was one of them. I think Airbnb was one of them. Typically, what happens in times of crisis is that innovation is required on a societal level, and that's also combined with moments of great change for individual people. So up and down the country there'll be people that are being laid off, and out of those, that is probably the catalyst for the next Zuckerberg, or whoever you want to call a person to emerge. Stock market, I mean, my personal view on the stock market is that over a long term, it's obviously good. I think the data suggests that. My inkling would be, well, this is personally what I'm doing. I'm looking for companies that I think will come out of this not just well, but will come out of it, looking even better and even rosier. So in particular, I'm thinking about kind of the big tech companies, because they're often sat on big piles of cash, which is exactly what you need in this sort of environment. And they have products and services which are not going to go away. So those sorts of companies, I think, could be good from a stock picking perspective. In terms of the wider market, my approach is generally to just tuck money away regularly and not worry too much about timing, and just have a long-term mindset.
Brilliant. Jazakallah khair. Next question. Ardit Isaku said, I'm from Albania, and here Sharia compliant loans are not welcomed by the central bank up to now. One of the banks backed by a foreign Islamic bank actually tried but failed to get a license. So what do you think about having a global Sharia compliant loans for students and startups? I think in principle it's a great idea, but the challenge you'll have is that in order to give loans in particular, you need to do the credit checks on it. And until we have a kind of global identity and a global, digital wallet type approach, that any lender can lend to anyone globally based on that data, which is robust, I think we're going to struggle for any one lender to be able to offer loans outside of its jurisdiction. Like for me to offer loans to Albania is just impossible. I have no idea of what the Albanian context is and whether or not I'm giving money to someone who's not going to pay me back or someone who is going to pay me back. So that will be, I think, the big challenge. Ardit Isaku also asks, I know a lot of my friends, new couples, taking loans from fractional banks because that they don't have any other solution. What are your suggestions? I think that I assume you mean fractional reserve banks, like sure, mainstream banks, i.e., banks that are offering interest-based loans. I think the answer is that check out forum.islamicfinanceguru.com. We've got 2 muftis on there, and if there are any specific circumstances where there's a real necessity, like there's a darura, then there may be allowance to get a loan, but typically it's not really permissible unless it's dire straits. Abu Bakr Abadi asks, what do you think about investing in gold with this context of the crisis and the risk of hyperinflation? Any thoughts, guys?
I mean, I think I heard that gold was increased its price by a significant percentage. I think the double digits. Gold went already up by. I mean, I think generally gold is always a safe bet in terms of recession, because obviously it's counter to the fall in value. But at the same time, I would also say that it's not a productive asset. So I mean, it goes both ways.
Sure. Jazakallah khair, Muhammad. I mean, my personal view is that, I mean, I just don't invest in gold. I think it's a bit of a waste of time because, you can just, gold is a store of value as opposed to an investment. And I don't think you should even, when you say, what about investing in gold? I don't think that's correct. You should say, what about storing my money in gold as opposed to a bank account? And to that, I would say, just put it in a bank account. It's a lot less hassle, a lot cheaper, and a lot easier to keep safe. I wouldn't think of it as an investment because it doesn't make any money for you. You could just put it into something probably equally safe, like a London property, or buy a portion of a London property using something like yielders, and it will actually make you money over 20 years. Okay, cool. So we've got. I'm aware of the time, by the way. So we probably should wrap up in the next, few minutes, maybe like in the next 5 minutes. But let's take these questions because I don't want people to ask questions and then not be responded to. Imran K asks, what are your views on the market for Islamic finance in the UK? Consumers have typically been quite apathetic, but do you see that changing with the younger generation who are more in touch with their religion? Mohsin, do you have any thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts, but time will not allow. I think the short answer is, let's see. Honestly, like, we don't know. Let's see. I think what we are seeing though is, a wave of people that are trying to tap into that. Whether that is matched by the demand remains to be seen.
Brilliant. I actually think, just coming off the back of that, I actually think that the fact that loads of people are coming into this market means there's a bit more competition. And what we do at Islamic Finance Guru is we just try and make things transparent and easy to compare. So we've got our comparison engines. And I think all of that will mean that prices will go down. More entrants, more competition, more transparency equals lower prices. And I actually think that Muslims who are apathetic are still, there's a gradient, right, where you've got non-Muslim levels of pricing and Muslim levels of pricing, and then on this gradient you've got really practicing here who are buying it because they're Muslim, and then you've got non-Muslims who are buying it here because they're non-Muslim. And at this level, you're like slightly Muslim, but you still buy an Islamic product because it's Islamic. So if it's just a bit more expensive than your mainstream, you'd buy it. But if it goes higher than that, and it gets really, really high, then your taqwa levels have to go higher with it. So what I'm saying is, as prices go down to closer and closer to the non-Muslim mainstream market, more and more people will actually start buying, and that will then have a kind of circular effect where because there's more profits in the Muslim economy, then even more prices will go down, and then eventually, hopefully, we will get to the mainstream market. And when we do that, then then obviously everyone will be buying it. T. Dean says, Salam, fantastic job, guys. Keep it up. May Allah bless you in all your endeavors and make you successful in this world and the hereafter. Ameen. My question was, what's your opinion on investing in oil? Thoughts, guys?
I mean, oil's crashed. I believe in America, they were paying you to take their oil, isn't it?
Yeah, Kabli, our videographer, he had this idea where he said that if I was a prime minister of a country, I'd hire like a whole bunch of oil tankers, send them across to the USA, tell them, guys, fill this all up, and then take them back and like dump them in a field somewhere, and just keep it, because they've paid us for this oil, and then we can sell it afterwards.
I mean, my general view is, because of climate change, you should be investing away from oil into more climate-friendly energies. But that's more of an internal rather than a purely monetary view.
Mohsin, what are your thoughts?
Oil. So there's one school of thought is that this whole COVID thing is going to mean that a lot more people stay at home, they travel less, a lot more companies are going to start onshoring a lot more. That's going to lead to a decline in oil demand, and therefore there's going to be really the drop in price is going to be sustained. The other school of thought is that not really, because even if there's lower demand in the Western world, there's going to be this standard kind of expectation of increased affluence in the developing world. That's going to increase the middle class over there. They are going to replace the slack, if there is any, of oil demand. If I'm honest, I think that my view, I've not really looked like in depth on this. I think my view is just like a really high level one about the reluctance of people generally to change. And I think given that oil is, it's the lubricant of the world economy in many ways. And I think that the demand for oil will not really subside in a really big way post-COVID. So if there are absolute bargains to be had, whether that's investing in oil directly or whether that's investing in companies like BP or Shell, etc., if there is an absolute genuine bargain to be had, I personally wouldn't be against investing in oil.
Jazakallah khair. Like the name, does IFG review commercial property finance offers? Are there any companies you recommend looking into? Commercial property finance offers. I think you mean commercial property finance
offerings, maybe.
Yeah, offerings. We can help with that sort of thing. I mean, if you go on our website, you go on the Islamic mortgage section, you can have a look through there, or just drop us a line on our contact us page and say that this is the kind of rough deal structure. This is the price of the property, this is how much you're looking for financing, and we can put you in touch with someone at Rayyan or Gatehouse or someone as well. So yeah, happy to help on that front. Final question for today, inshallah, is T. Dean, also being from a medical background, what would your opinion be in investing in pharmaceutical companies during COVID and post-COVID, with possibly many strains of this virus needing vaccination? So I think high level, my thoughts are that it's definitely something to look into, but often this kind of stuff is firstly really up for chance. So like who develops this vaccine is kind of, it's up for grabs. And I suspect because of it's such a global pandemic, I suspect that either all companies are going to benefit because each of them is going to develop this, and because it's going to be all shared knowledge anyway. It would be just a disgrace if GlaxoSmithKline discovered it and kept it for themselves. I just don't think that's going to happen. And then the alternative is that no one is really going to benefit from it because it's such a needed thing. I suspect what's going to happen overall is all these pharmaceutical companies are going to benefit somewhat. So, but it won't be to such a massive amount that it's going to, fundamentally change the economics of their business. Like it's not going to make them go, 5x. overnight. So given that, I would just look at quality pharmaceutical companies, if just like you would any stock, and go for that. Oh, Jazakallah khair, Suleiman. And then, final question. I stopped working for this client. I had no fatwa for this, as I didn't know where to ask for. What are your suggestions? So I'd point you to our forum.islamicfinanceguru.com, where you've got 2 muftis who are sat there ready and waiting, like the guards outside Helm's Deep were awaiting the orcs when they attacked in Lord of the Rings. So there we are. They will inshallah be able to help. Well, it's been an absolute pleasure, everyone. Jazakallah khair for tuning in. Do subscribe to this YouTube channel, because inshallah we're going to be producing a lot more videos and a lot of live videos as well in the future. And if you have any thoughts, ideas about things that we should be covering in the future that perhaps from this episode that you thought would be great to have that in a much more detail, or other topics, then please either comment on this video, it'll be available afterwards as well, or drop us a line on our contact us page on the website, and inshallah we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Assalamu alaikum.
Salam.